Everyone has played a Pokemon game before, and everyone has their own list of favorites and least favorites, but which Pokemon game is the worst? Let's play a bit of each game to find out, starting with the original games, Pokemon Red and Blue, so make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and now, let's get into it. Pokemon Red and Blue were the first games in the series, so they're arguably the most important in the series. If they were bad games, then there probably wouldn't be any more follow-up Pokemon games, and if they're good, then, well, I guess here we are today. While they might not have aged the best due to all of the updates Pokemon's received throughout the years and the fact that they're on the original Game Boy console, the game doesn't really have that many flaws outside of just being old. But I guess the same can be said about your mother, and we still love her. If you were to go back to play Pokemon Red and Blue today, as someone who got into Pokemon within the last few generations, the feeling would be night and day. While if you were to go back to play something like Pokemon Diamond and Pearl as a newer fan, which released almost 20 years ago, doesn't that make you feel kinda old? The core gameplay and mechanics wouldn't really feel too much different. The glitches in Pokemon Red and Blue can be a bit annoying, as a lot of them get in the way of natural gameplay, like the fact that every move has a chance to miss, and some moves like Focus Energy just don't work like they're supposed to work. The game also tells you next to no information about how each move works, doesn't even tell you the accuracy or the power, so a lot of it's just a guessing game to see which moves are the best. Now the glitches aren't all a bad thing though, as Red and Blue has some of the most iconic glitches in all of gaming history, like the various missing no glitches to help you get rare items or cool Pokemon, glitch cities which can be really fun to explore, and making your character spin around indefinitely because, well, why not? Red and Blue set the groundwork for Pokemon, and although they might be a pretty bare-bones experience compared to what you're used to today in Pokemon games, because of all of this, I will put Pokemon Red and Blue in the C tier rating, placing them right about in the middle. We'll see how many games end up above or below Red and Blue, as they offer a good benchmark to see which games are really good and which games aren't that great. But now we have to move on to Pokemon Yellow version, which is basically just the same as Red and Blue, except it has Pikachu on the cover, hence the name Special Pikachu Edition. The game itself looks a lot cleaner with updated sprites, has some glitches fixed, and adds a few other cool things like the ability to get every single Kanto starter within the game itself without trading, and this random Pikachu minigame. There's really not much else to say about Yellow version on top of Red and Blue, so because of all of this, the fact that it's a slight upgrade over Red and Blue will also put it in B tier, but just right in front of Red and Blue. Moving on to Generation 2 with Pokemon Gold and Silver, this is where Pokemon really started to pick up its stride and make a lot of improvements on the series. Generation 2 as a whole was the golden child for so long among Pokemon fans that the last few years or so the internet kind of just turned on them. Pokemon games in general go through these weird cycles where games are loved, then hated, then loved, then hated. And sure, Pokemon Gold and Silver aren't perfect, but they still brought some improvements to the franchise. First, there's breeding and held items, which are staples for competitive battling, and Shiny Pokemon, which is my favorite addition Gold and Silver added. While I might not have cared too much for Shiny Pokemon in the past, it's part of Pokemon that I really started to love over the last year or so, and a part of Pokemon that so many people still care so much about. You might put 20 or so hours into the core game by beating the game, but shiny hunters are willing to spend 20 plus hours in the same game just to get one shiny Pokemon. That alone adds so much to Pokemon games. One of the best videos I ever made was a recent video involving me shiny hunting for one of the first times ever with a bunch of other shiny hunters, and that wouldn't have been possible without Pokemon Gold and Silver. Pokemon Gold and Silver are also the most natural sequels you ever got to a Pokemon game outside of maybe Black 2 and White 2, but we'll get to those later. Every mainline Pokemon game is tied to the same story and timeline, at least they're supposed to be, but with Pokemon Gold and Silver, it directly references events that happened in Red and Blue, continues Team Rocket's story, and even lets you revisit Kanto in the post-game to see what it's like after the events of Red and Blue concluded. While that version of Kanto is very condensed, can be finished in only a couple of hours, it's still the best post-game we've ever seen in any Pokemon game. Now for the flaws. The biggest one people like to talk about are the level gaps. It doesn't make that much sense how Jasmine, the 6th gym leader, has a higher level Pokemon than Pryce, the 7th gym leader, especially when you consider the fact that before you battle Pryce, you have to do some Team Rocket events in the same town and also go to the Lake of Rage and do some stuff there, which will end up leveling up your Pokemon even more. Sure, you could also make the argument that in the middle part of this game, the gym leaders can be battled in just about any order, but it still doesn't make sense to have the levels work this way. On top of that, when your Pokemon are in the mid to late 30s or so, you still encounter trainers or even Team Rocket members with Pokemon in their 20s. Now I'm sure you've heard about this exact issue a ton on YouTube especially lately, so I won't dwell on this for too long, but simply just raising Pryce's Pokemon to the late 30s instead, bumping up some of the Team Rocket levels around there as well, and then possibly bumping up Claire's Pokemon by a couple levels too would be a pretty easy fix to make this game a little bit better. On the bright side, the level discrepancy is the only big flaw I can really think of without nitpicking too much on Gold and Silver. Because of this, I will still put Pokemon Gold and Silver in B tier above Yellow version, much like how we ranked them about 2 years ago. Every now and again I like to rank each Pokemon game, and at the end of the video we'll see how this list compares to my previous one. After Pokemon Gold and Silver, we saw Pokemon Crystal release, which is much like Yellow version was to Red and Blue. It's a slight improvement upon the previous games. The Pokemon sprites have a cool animation when the battle starts now, and when you go into a new town, you'll see this cool drop-down box telling you where you are, which is pretty convenient. You would think that this would be a great opportunity to also fix the level gap issue that Gold and Silver has, much like they did with other games we'll talk about later, but no, the gym leaders have the same exact teams and same levels as Gold and Silver. There's more of a focus on Suicune this time because it's on the cover of the game and adds in Yucine, who I don't think anybody even likes by the way, but it was also the first Pokemon game that lets you play as a girl, which is a bit more inclusive. I'll still put Pokemon Crystal and B tier along with Gold and Silver, since much like Yellow version, the improvements don't add too much, and I wouldn't say Crystal is the worst Pokemon game either. Now we can move on over to the Game Boy Advance, where Pokemon really started to look like Pokemon with the release of Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. There were a lot of improvements in Ruby and Sapphire, and I would go as far to say that Ruby and Sapphire had the most important improvements to Pokemon out of any generation when it comes to core mechanics. First, we have abilities, which can really define a Pokemon nowadays. We have a lot more held items to work with, as although this mechanic was introduced in Gold and Silver, there weren't really many held items in Gold and Silver that were good, and similar to the berry mechanic, it was vastly improved in Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, and you all know I love berries. EVs and IVs were introduced too and remain the same in modern Pokemon, and before Ruby and Sapphire, the mechanics behind a Pokemon's stats were very different and are a staple to competitive battling today. On top of that, we have natures which influence these stats. I also almost forgot to talk about this, but on top of all the improvements to competitive battling, we also saw the introduction of double battles, which remain the main format of official competitive battling in VGC events. It's not super prevalent in any of the main series games, unless you count the GameCube games as main series, but they technically aren't. We can finally run in these games too. The legendary Pokemon are much more relevant to the overall story compared to the previous couple of games, and we learn more about their lore. We get a new evil team for the first time in this generation, well, two evil teams rather, in Team Aqua and Team Magma. For the sake of the story, Team Aqua and Team Magma are basically the same, although they have different Pokemon on their teams, and make these version exclusives a bit more different than the previous ones released. I would give the overall edge to Sapphire version though, since Lotad, one of the best Pokemon ever created alongside its final form, Ludicolo, which is arguably the greatest Pokemon ever created, are Sapphire exclusives. Just look at it, it's a pineapple duck wearing a sombrero. How can you not love it? As for the flaws, and this might be where my bias starts to show, but at the end of the day this is a tier list and almost all tier lists are biased, there aren't really many flaws I can think of for Ruby and Sapphire. Sure, the abundance of water routes can be annoying in the later half of the game, and in my experience this game requires the most HM usage out of any other Pokemon game, which is annoying. I can't tell you how many times I got to Evergrande City just to realize I forgot to pick up the Waterfall HM. It's really not that huge of an issue. It is also annoying how you can't transfer over Pokemon from Red and Blue or Gold and Silver into Ruby and Sapphire, as although a lot of the mechanics behind how Pokemon work was changed in Ruby and Sapphire, I still think they could have figured out a way to transfer them over. I remember a time where I would rank Ruby and Sapphire in as low as C tier, but considering they're the games I've replayed the most at this point, they grew on me a lot more lately, so much so that I'll put them in A tier because they're one of my favorite Pokemon games now, but not quite my absolute favorite, and they're probably the games I've made the most videos on. Following Ruby and Sapphire, we saw the release of Fire Red and Leaf Green, but we'll skip that for now and move on to Emerald version, which is an enhanced version of Ruby and Sapphire. Unlike Crystal version, Emerald changed some of the gym leaders' teams around, with my favorite change being Watson having a Manectric as his ace Pokemon instead of just having Voltorbs and a Magneton like he did in Ruby and Sapphire, which didn't make a whole lot of sense. Tate and Liza also have more than 2 Pokemon, making this fight a lot better as well. Emerald version merged the 2 teams into the game, having them compete against each other, even adding a couple of new events involving Team Aqua and Team Magma compared to what we saw in Ruby and Sapphire. This made both teams make a lot more sense, and it also added the Battle Frontier, which is a very fun battle-focused form of post-game content. Other future Pokemon games had similar post-game content that focused on battling, even Crystal version had a Battle Tower, but most of them don't compare to the many options you had in the Battle Frontier and Hoenn. With most enhanced versions, I don't really have much else to say on top of what they improved from the previous games they're based off of, so with all that in mind, I'll stick Emerald version in A tier alongside Ruby and Sapphire. Now we can travel back to the Kanto region for the 3rd time in only 3 generations with Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green. These games are literally just an updated version of Red and Blue to add all the new mechanics on the Game Boy Advance that the following generations added, but follow mostly the same exact story. There's some new post-game content in the Sevi Islands, which is a sub-region that explains what happened to Team Rocket between the events of Red and Blue and Gold and Silver. It's not nearly as expansive as the Kanto post-game we saw in Gold and Silver, but it was still something new. I would say if you're a more hardcore Pokemon fan, or if you're even just a step farther than being a casual Pokemon fan, which is hard to quantify, Fire Red and Leaf Green would be the best ways to experience the Kanto region. It still has a lot of the same charm as Red and Blue with far less flaws and with a lot more improvements, overall making them better than Red and Blue, but not the worst Pokemon game, so I'll stick them in B tier. That closes off the Game Boy Advance era of Pokemon, allowing us to move on to Pokemon Diamond and Pearl to kick off the Nintendo DS era. As for improvements, Diamond and Pearl split moves into physical moves and special moves rather than all moves of a certain type being either physical or special, as they were previously. This made some Pokemon a lot better, as Pokemon like Gengar, for example, can now use special attacking ghost moves with the same type attack bonus instead of relying on ghost moves being physical moves like they were previously, which wasn't optimal for Gengar. On top of that, these were the first games with online functionality. This is something we take for granted nowadays, as video games having online functionality is a staple nowadays, but when Diamond and Pearl first came out, this was groundbreaking. I remember dreaming of being able to play Pokemon online or being able to trade with anyone around the world, and when Diamond and Pearl came out, I spent so much time tracking down Pokemon on the GTS, and I also spent so much time learning about competitive battling, now that I had a lot more people to battle with. In terms of the regular story and pacing, it's fine. There is a weird gap between the second and third gym, and there also is a little bit of confusion with the third gym as well as Crasher Wake's gym in terms of the order, but that gets resolved later on. Diamond and Pearl also run pretty poorly and have some slowdown, and while it isn't as bad as some of the newer Pokemon games, it's still pretty noticeable. Despite all of this, I think the pros still outweigh the cons, and I'll stick them in A tier. I'm always really happy to play through the Sinnoh region again, and I don't know what it is about Diamond and Pearl, but they're so easy for me to make a video on. Next up, we got a banger, and it's Pokemon Platinum version. Whenever someone tells me what their favorite Pokemon game is, Pokemon Platinum version is the most common answer I hear, and it's for a very good reason. First, the game just runs a bit better than Diamond and Pearl, which is great. The gym order is rearranged slightly to have a better flow, and the gym leaders' teams are even changed around to have them make a bit more sense and include more Sinnoh Pokemon. Giratina's story is explained a bit more with the Distortion World, which to be honest I'm not a huge fan of because I always get lost in the Distortion World, but Giratina is my favorite legendary Pokemon, so I can still appreciate the lore. We have the Return to the Battle Frontier in the post-game too, which is a bit smaller than the ones we saw in Pokemon Emerald version, and admittedly, I never really spent too much time on this version of the Battle Frontier, so I don't have too much to say about it. And last but not least, we saw the introduction of appliances in Pokemon with the various Rotom forms. Rotom is just so cool, and I don't know what it is about animalmorphic appliances, but I just find them so funny. With all that in mind, I'm putting Pokemon Platinum in S tier. I'm currently playing through Platinum right now in my own time, it's that good, although I took a break to Masuda hunt for a shiny Pachirisu, which is taking a lot longer than I hoped. Following Platinum version, we saw the release of the second remake games in the series in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. These are remakes of Pokemon Gold and Silver, which have a lot of the additions that Crystal version added in them as well, but much like with Fire Red and Leaf Green, they updated them to make them modern for the time and added some nice features like having Pokemon follow you around. The levels of each gym leader were altered slightly to what they were originally, but they're still not perfect, with Price still having a lower level team than Jasmine. Despite all of this, they're still the best Johto based games we've had, as they're just better than Crystal version and of course better than Gold and Silver, so I'll place them above those games but at the tail end of A tier. Changing over to Generation 5 with Pokemon Black and White, and we have another banger. Black and White are different than previous Pokemon games in the sense that the main story only has new Generation 5 Pokemon obtainable in them, making them a unique experience. Some people didn't like this at the time especially, but playing through a brand new Pokemon game for the very first time and not know most of the Pokemon were was such a cool experience. In terms of improvements with mechanics, there really wasn't much, since at this point in Pokemon there really wasn't much that needed to be changed. I guess they did add triple battles, but those were later removed as nobody really ever played those. Instead, Pokemon Black and White improved upon the existing formula and had a lot of cool small details unlike any other Pokemon game previously. It has one of the better stories of any Pokemon game with some of the coolest characters like N, and I believe Game Freak focusing on what worked rather than trying to add a bunch of new things for the sake of adding new things was a really good call for this game, making Black and White some of the best games in the series. It's a shame they're one of the worst selling entries in the series and a lot of people skipped over them, but I still think they deserve a solid A tier rating. If you haven't played through Generation 5, I highly recommend that you do, starting with Black and White 1. Following the events of Pokemon Black and White, we have Pokemon Black and White 2, which are just a direct sequel. They take place a few years after Black and White 1 and changed up the Unova region a little bit, with a few more towns, some new gym leaders, and the ability to catch some older Pokemon in the main story as well. Black and White 2 also has so many extra things to do in them. What I mean by that is there's so many random side quests you can do which add a lot of playability to this game. A couple of years ago, I did a video where I played through Black and White 2 for 100 hours, and I probably could have pushed that to more like 200 with all the content that this game had to offer. They just built upon Pokemon Black and White, which were already great, but still made them unique, and I'm just gonna say it, they're my favorite Pokemon game, so with that in mind, I'm putting them in S tier above Pokemon Platinum. As we leave the DS era of Pokemon and move on to the 3DS, this starts the trend of games that I don't really know quite as well as the older generations. This is also where a lot of people would say modern Pokemon game begins with Pokemon X and Y. Being the first mainline Pokemon games on the 3DS, that was a pretty big deal, and this was when Pokemon really started to get weird. First, we have the EXP share, which was always on, which is a bit controversial, but I will say it is nice how grinding isn't as needed anymore. But if you're the type of person who likes to battle every single trainer, you'll probably be overleveled. Second, with the 3DS being more powerful than the DS, we have Pokemon in full 3D, making the world more immersive. In terms of mechanics, we don't really see too much improvement in the regular core mechanics like we saw with Generation 5 as well, but this is where gimmicks started to become a thing with Mega Evolution in Generation 6, which was later removed from Pokemon. These were temporary in-battle evolutions, which to this day are still my favorite gimmick mechanic. While they did give Mega Evolutions to mostly already strong Pokemon that didn't really need it, in some cases, like for Garchomp, the Mega version was just worse than the base form, and some weaker Pokemon like Altaria and Kangaskhan received Mega forms which made them much better. I would say that the biggest flaws for X and Y would be that they are easier than the previous Pokemon games, and they feel a bit unfinished. I don't mean unfinished in terms of the game being rushed or the quality of the game being poor, but unfinished in terms of the story and lore in the Kalos region. There was a lot more they could have done with X and Y, perhaps with a follow-up version and Z version, but strangely they didn't receive any sort of follow-up or even any DLC, even though other 3DS games at the time did receive DLC. Because of this, I'll put Pokemon X and Y in C tier just below Pokemon Red and Blue. I don't think they're bad games or even the worst Pokemon games by any means, as they do still have their own unique charm since this era of Pokemon was still really special to me for so many reasons, but it feels like there should have just been more here. I'm also pretty sure X and Y are the Pokemon games I played through the least, as I think I only played through them 4 or 5 times by now, while I've played through a game like Ruby and Sapphire 4 or 5 times in the last year alone. After Pokemon X and Y, Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire were released. While they are remakes of Ruby and Sapphire versions, they're more like reimagined versions. Instead of just being a direct remake like Heart Gold and Soul Silver was to Gold and Silver, they changed things up by incorporating Mega Evolutions into the main story, and even adding some new Mega Pokemon, changing up Mauville City to make it more like Lumio City in X and Y, and overall made Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire feel like a new game rather than a remake. The best way I can describe this game is more like if they just made a Hoenn game for the very first time on the 3DS, rather than going back and updating an older game with newer mechanics. Overall, I think they are the best remake games we've ever received in the series, and because of that I will still put them in A tier alongside Ruby and Sapphire, but above Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which might be a bit controversial, putting all of the Hoenn games in A tier. Next up on the 3DS we have Pokemon Sun and Moon. I talk about these games a lot, but let's start off with synopsis and the pros first. Sun and Moon are unique in the sense that there's no gym badges to be obtained in this game, and we have island trials instead, which are missions with various tasks, some of which lead to a totem fight, which are bigger, more powerful versions of Pokemon you have to fight. These are cool bosses that I think should have remained a staple in future Pokemon games, and although we have similar things to Totem Pokemon in newer games like Raid Dens, they aren't quite the same. The trials in general remind me of Yokai Watch missions, which if you haven't played before, Yokai Watch was a series similar to Pokemon that involved you catching and battling creatures. It was very popular in Japan between 2013 and 2016, and even began to rival Pokemon in terms of popularity, so I can't help but to think that Yokai Watch was a big reason for these changes. As for the gimmick this time around, we saw the introduction of Z moves, which were really strong moves Pokemon could go for once per battle if they were holding a certain Z crystal item. This meant for a lot of surprise attacks overall, and it was my least favorite battle gimmick we've seen so far because of the randomness and the fact that it was kind of overpowered. Overall though, I just wasn't a huge fan of Pokemon Sun and Moon. I think the story was a bit weak and underexplained, especially when it comes to the Ultra Beast. The game was interrupted way too many times by dialogue, which most of the times was rather unnecessary, and the Alola region itself felt very linear and more confusing than previous regions due to how it was broken up, and many of the routes were just a straight line with very little exploration. On top of that, they don't really run super well on the 3DS either, but most of that can be attributed to the fact that the 3DS was pretty old by the time these games released, so this game running poorly isn't as big of a deal as it is for some other Pokemon games. Because of all of this, I'm putting Sun and Moon in F tier. They're just the games I enjoy playing the least, and the ones that I don't really ever care for replaying again in the future. Do I think they're the worst Pokemon games? We still have a few more games to talk about, and we'll discuss more about that at the end. Following Pokemon Sun and Moon, we have Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. These are supposed to be enhanced versions upon Sun and Moon, but this time they split them into 2 different games, and they expand upon the story with Necrozma and Ultra Necrozma as well, being one of the hardest fights in any Pokemon game. But aside from that, it's still pretty much just Sun and Moon, but split into 2 more games. Generation 7 as a whole seems to be the most polarizing generation, with people either loving them and having them ranked really highly on their tier list, or people being like me and not really caring too much for them, and putting Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon in D tier. I will give them the benefit of the doubt and rank them a bit higher than Sun and Moon because they are technically better, I guess. But releasing only a year after Sun and Moon with barely any improvements and then splitting them into 2 different games make them the most disappointing Pokemon game to me. I tried to keep my Gen 7 hate to a minimum, so I won't go any further, and for now, let's just move on to the Nintendo Switch with Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. In terms of looks, they are the best looking Pokemon games on the Switch in my opinion, but as a game, they're just a remake of Red and Blue with different catching mechanics to mimic how they are in Pokemon Go, to capitalize on that game's success and to get casual fans to buy the game for a console. Overall, it was a pretty smart strategy, but I will say I'm not a huge fan of the catching mechanic in this game. It makes leveling up Pokemon very tedious, but I will say that seeing the Kanto region in full 3D as somebody who started playing Pokemon with Red and Blue was amazing. Seeing Kanto for the first time like this was breathtaking, although there were easy games that were dumbed down a bit. There's really not much else I can say to them, as they are just basically remakes of Fire Red and Leaf Green, which are remakes of Red and Blue, except this time the story makes a lot less sense because they changed the characters around, but still had the original Red character in the game, which just doesn't make any sense to me at all. But I'm gonna have to put them in D tier just above Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. They were amazing the first time I ever played them, but I don't really care for them much anymore and don't really feel the need to ever play them again. Now, the Switch era was where things got a little bit grim for Pokemon, as following Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee in 2019, we saw the release of Pokemon Sword and Shield. The first new generation games on the Switch, and there was a lot of hype surrounding them. Sword and Shield were a return to form coming off the Alola, where gym leaders make their return, something I personally prefer, and overall it felt more like a Pokemon game to me than the last couple of entries in the series. This time the gimmick is Dynamaxing, where Pokemon get really big and a bit stronger for a few turns. It ties into the story well enough to make sense, and as for other new additions, this game added raid dens, which we still have in Scarlet and Violet. Sword and Shield saw a big jump in quality of life improvements, making it easier to get battle-ready Pokemon. But now, on to the bad. The bad parts about Pokemon Sword and Shield have been talked about so much that saying it's like beating a dead horse wouldn't even do it justice. The first big issue that people didn't like was Dexit, which was the fact that a lot of older Pokemon didn't appear in Pokemon Sword and Shield and weren't even programmed to the games. While this was unfortunate, you can't naturally catch every Pokemon in any game anyway, and I don't know if many people ever even felt the effects of this. I personally never wanted to transfer over older Pokemon while playing through the main story of any Pokemon game, but if I had the option to include every Pokemon or not, I of course would still pick the option to include every Pokemon. Then of course there's the graphics, which aren't the worst for a Pokemon game we've seen surprisingly, but compared to Let's Go, it was definitely a step back. The games themselves felt a bit shorter too, with the only post-game content being the 2 DLC packs, which were pretty decent. But the Crown Tundra DLC was definitely better, since it had more to explore and added Dynamax Adventures, which people still play to this day. Now, this might be controversial as the internet isn't very receptive to other people having opinions, especially if they strongly dislike something, but I'm putting Pokemon Sword and Shield in C tier just behind Red and Blue. They do have their flaws, and I was tempted to put them in B tier, but to be honest, I would still say I prefer X and Y over Sword and Shield. But in the end, I think Sword and Shield are just fine. And while the vocal minority tends to hate on these games, they seem like they were still very well received casually. Following Sword and Shield, we have Legends Arceus, the most unique mainline Pokemon game ever released. I know there's people out there who might contest Legends Arceus being a mainline game, but the criteria I'm going on for a mainline game is just whatever Game Freak says, so we'll count it. The focus this time around is more on adventure and discovery as we travel back to Hisui, or Old Sinnoh, and learn about its history. This was a significant change from anything we've seen, especially coming off the heels of Pokemon Sword and Shield, and they really delivered. While it isn't for everybody due to how different it is from the regular Pokemon game formula, the freedom this game offered was unmatched. I will admit I wasn't a big fan with how the Pokédex completion was a tie-in to the progress of the overall games, and I often found myself just wandering around catching Pokemon in order to just progress the story, but that's my only big gripe with this game. Sure, it would have been cool if online battling was in this game, but I understand that the mechanics for battling didn't really allow for online battling, with how much they altered them. It worked really well for a single player experience, which was a nice change of pace. I will admit that I don't feel the need to replay this game as much as I do with some of the older Pokemon games, as this game is a lot more story focused, and doesn't offer the same amount of replayability as traditional Pokemon games. But the experience I had when I first played this game was really rewarding and a lot of fun. While I wouldn't recommend Legends Arceus as your first Pokemon game, it is still a great game overall and far from being the worst Pokemon game, so I'll put it in A tier. While Legends Arceus was a rare, very well received game on the Switch amongst pretty much all Pokemon fans, this takes us to Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, which, well, are remakes of Diamond and Pearl. Pokemon fans have asked for remakes of Diamond and Pearl for years now, and we finally got them, but unlike Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which were more like reimagines of Ruby and Sapphire, these were just direct remakes with a few enhancements, more akin to Fire Red and Leaf Green, and they were also made by an outside company in Ilka and not made by Game Freak. To be honest, I don't really mind all of that. I already liked Diamond and Pearl, so modernizing them on the Switch was great, although unlike Fire Red and Leaf Green or even Ruby and Sapphire, they didn't really need the update like the previous remakes did, as the core mechanics between Generation 4 and Generation 8 didn't change nearly as much as they did for say Generations 3 to Generation 6 or even Generations 1 to Generation 3. The art style isn't for everyone either, but at the end of the day, the game is just Diamond and Pearl on a modern console with some new features like the Sinnoh Underground, quality of life improvements with the Pokétch and HM usage, and an updated battle tower. They aren't too well received for the main reason that people wanted the gym leaders to have platinum teams and have the platinum decks in the game, which would have been an improvement, and definitely would have made a lot more sense, but they're still stuck using their original Diamond and Pearl team instead. I personally really don't understand the amount of hate on this game, as that's really the only big issue I can see with it. So I'll put them in B tier because they're basically the same as Diamond and Pearl, but feel a bit off and don't have quite the same charm. It would be slightly better if they did an Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire style remake for Diamond and Pearl and perhaps include Dynamaxing, which were the new feature from Sword and Shield, into Diamond and Pearl, but they didn't, and surprisingly I don't really see many people suggesting that change. Instead, the biggest flaw I see people complain about this game is the fact that it's not a Platinum remake. I can understand why people don't like it, but I don't understand why people who don't like it don't understand why people like it. And finally, we have Scarlet and Violet. I'm going to keep this one short and sweet since they're the most recent Pokemon games and fresh in everyone's mind. While the core gameplay is solid and I love the openness of the Paldea region, and in theory there's a lot of good things to like in this game, the execution was just so poor. I hate harping on the same things like graphics, but after playing this game more again over the last couple of months, it started to really annoy me how bad some things looked. It's worse than Sword and Shield somehow, which really weren't that great to begin with. As for the battle gimmicks, we have Terastallization this time, which is pretty cool and allows our Pokemon to change their types and also have this cool hat. And from what I hear, competitive battling is great in this game because of Terastallization, but the game itself is just rather meh. I feel it could have been so much better, and the DLC did help a bit, especially the second wave of DLC with the Unova tie-ins, but I'd have to put Scarlet and Violet in D tier. There are still some great moments in Scarlet and Violet, and I love Paradox Pokemon, but much like Ultra Beast from Sun and Moon, they really aren't explaining too much in the main game. I think these games had so much potential, I wouldn't go as far as saying they're the worst Pokemon games, but they are definitely the most underwhelming as we know how good these games could have been. So there's my full tier list of mainline games, which probably looks wildly different than yours. At the end of the day, I do think all of the mainline Pokemon games are pretty good in their own right, but of course I like some more than others. Here's my list from 2 years ago, which is still pretty similar, no significant jumps, but just a smaller B tier now. So if I were to answer which Pokemon game was the worst out of all the ones that I played in this video, it would just have to be Sun and Moon. Let me know in the comments down below what your tier list looks like, or just what your favorite and least favorite games are, or just call me a Game Freak shill in the comments for actually liking some Pokemon games that you don't like, or disliking Pokemon games that you like. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to support the channel. Have a great rest of your day. I'll see y'all next time. Thank you so much for watching, and bye-bye.